My mother told the flight attendant I was just the family assistant, waved her boarding pass like it was a royal decree, and didn't bother turning her head when the gate agent's scanner beeped red and then went very, very quiet. The agent looked at her screen, looked at me, looked at her screen again, and pressed a button that made a different woman in a navy blazer materialize out of nowhere within 90 seconds. My mother laughed that laugh she does, the one that's supposed to make everyone else feel stupid for taking things seriously. She had no idea that 22 years of being underestimated had just quietly, finally, run out of road. But before I get to the part where the gate agent said the words Captain Reyes into her radio and my mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before, I need you to understand how we got to that gate in the first place. Because this isn't really a story about an airport. It's a story about what happens when you spend your whole life being the load-bearing wall in a house full of people who think they built it themselves. I grew up in a split-level house outside Dayton, Ohio, with green aluminum siding and a basketball hoop my father bolted to the garage the year my brother Davis was born, like he already knew which kid he was building things for. My father sold commercial insurance and believed, with the conviction of a man reciting scripture, that the only things worth respecting were things you could point to. A car, a trophy, a corner office. He used to say it standing in the kitchen with his tie loosened, like he was handing down a verdict. Talk is cheap, Hannah. Show me something I can put my hands on. I was 9 the first time I understood that sentence was never going to include me. I'd spent 6 building a model of the Wright Flyer for the regional science fair, cutting balsa wood at the kitchen table every night after homework, gluing my fingers together more times than I could count, painting the wing struts with a brush so thin I had to hold my breath to keep my hands steady. I won first place out of 41 schools. I carried that ribbon home like it was made of glass. My father looked at the model for maybe 4 seconds, picked it up, turned it over once, and set it back down without a word. 3 minutes later, Davis came barreling through the back door, holding a participation medal from a Pop Warner football scrimmage. Not even a win, just a medal for showing up. And my father lifted him clean off the ground and spun him around the kitchen until my mother had to tell him to watch the ceiling fan. That medal got a frame. My ribbon got lost somewhere between the science fair and the following Tuesday, and nobody in that house ever asked where it went. That was the architecture of my whole childhood, built one invisible brick at a time. Davis got the trophy case. I got the chore chart. Davis got driving lessons on his 16th birthday in the new Civic. I got told that my part-time job at the pharmacy would teach me responsibility, which was my mother's way of saying she wasn't going to pay for my gas. When my father died of a heart attack at 58, 2 weeks before my high school graduation, it was me who sat with the funeral director going over casket prices line by line because my mother said the numbers gave her a migraine, and it was me who wrote out 60-some thank you cards in careful handwriting at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning while Davis slept until 11 the next day because grief, apparently, hit him harder. My mother swept those cards off the counter a week later to make room for a new shrine of Davis's junior varsity certificates, and she didn't read a single one before they went in the trash. I got into the Air Force Academy at 18 on a full appointment, nominated by our congressman after an interview I'd prepared for alone in my bedroom with index cards, because nobody offered to help me practice. I brought the acceptance letter home in an envelope I'd ironed flat so it would look perfect when I handed it to her. My mother was clipping coupons at the kitchen table. She read the first paragraph, made a small sound through her nose, and said, "So they're going to put you in a uniform and tell you what to do for the next 10 years. Wonderful. At least somebody will finally manage you." Davis, 17 and sprawled across the couch with a controller in his hands, didn't even look up. "Bet you wash out by Thanksgiving," he said, and laughed at his own joke until he started coughing. I didn't wash out by Thanksgiving. I didn't wash out, period. I made a decision walking out of that kitchen that I would later spend 2 decades regretting and admiring myself for in equal measure. I decided I would simply stop needing anything from either of them. I folded that acceptance letter into my backpack, zipped it shut, and treated the sound of that zipper like an oath. I would become so competent, so quietly indispensable, that I would never again have to ask my family to see me. What I didn't understand at 18 was that competence without boundaries doesn't earn you respect. It just earns you a longer list of people willing to let you carry their weight. By the time I was 36, I was flying combat search and rescue out of forward operating bases I'm still not allowed to name to most people, going into places where the math on getting everyone out alive sometimes didn't work, and finding a way to make it work anyway. I've put a pavehawk down in a dust storm with visibility under 100 feet, guided in by a crew chief's voice and pure muscle memory, to pull 2 soldiers off a ridge that was actively taking fire. I've held a hover over open water at night with one engine running rough, close enough to a swimmer that the rotor wash was the only thing keeping him conscious, because the alternative was watching him go under. Out there, in the part of my life nobody at home ever asked a single question about, I was not invisible. I was the person other people's survival depended on. And then I'd land, peel off my flight suit, check my phone, and find a text from my mother that read, Davis needs $11,000 for the boat slip deposit before Friday or he loses it. Send when you can, you're not spending money out there anyway. That was the shape of my entire adult life, compressed into one text message. My mother never asked how the deployment was going. She asked for money the way other people ask for the time. It started small, help with a car repair, a little extra for Christmas, and it grew the way a hairline crack in a windshield grows, slow, and then suddenly all at once. Davis decided, somewhere in his late 20s, that his calling was logistics consulting for the defense industry, which as far as I could ever tell, meant he wore expensive blazers to coffee meetings and dropped the names of Pentagon contacts he'd met exactly once at a conference. I covered the first office lease when his firm, Davis, a folding table and a laptop, needed a real address to look legitimate to investors who never actually materialized. I covered it again 8 months later when the investors still hadn't materialized. His wife, Marissa, redid their kitchen twice in 4 years and never once asked where the money for it came from, the same way you don't ask where oxygen comes from, you just breathe it. I want to be precise about the number because for years I made myself not look at it directly, the way you don't look directly at the sun. Over 14 years of hazard pay, flight pay, deployment bonuses, money the Air Force pays you specifically because there is a real, calculated chance you will not survive your next mission. I sent home just over $370,000. Money that smelled like jet fuel and desert grit and the inside of a helicopter that had just taken small arms fire. And the entire time, in my mother's mind, and I quote a sentence she said to a neighbor once that got back to me, Hannah's fine, she just does paperwork somewhere overseas. She genuinely believed I sat at a desk. She cashed checks from a desk job that didn't exist while I was rappelling out of a hovering aircraft into water cold enough to stop a heart. The dinner that finally cracked something loose in me happened 2 Thanksgivings ago, at my mother's house, the same kitchen table where the science fair ribbon had quietly disappeared 27 years earlier. Davis showed up in a suit that cost more than my last car payment, poured himself wine before anyone had said grace, and held court for the better part of an hour about a classified logistics contract he claimed to be advising on for the Department of Defense. He said the name of a 2-star general the way you'd mention a guy from your gym. General Pruitt actually called me personally last week for my read on the supply chain piece, he said, swirling his glass, looking around the table to make sure everyone had caught it. Can't say much, obviously. National security and all that. My aunt actually gasped. My cousin leaned forward like she was watching a movie. I knew General Pruitt. I'd flown him out of a contested airstrip 11 months earlier under a heat warning that should have grounded every aircraft on the base, because he needed to be at a briefing 200 miles north in 4 hours, and there was no other way to get him there. He thanked me by name when he climbed out of my aircraft. He did not know who Davis was. He had never spoken to Davis. The classified contract did not exist. I sat there with a fork in my hand, doing the breathing I do when I'm 50 feet over open water at night, trying not to think about how thin the margin is, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, and I did not say a single word. My mother reached across the table, patted Davis's arm like he was a prize dog, and turned to me with that particular flatness in her eyes she reserves for moments she wants to draw blood. See, Hannah, your brother's out there doing real work that matters. Maybe he can put in a good word and get you something better than flying a desk. The table laughed, every single person at it. I smiled, because verbal arguments at that table had never once worked in my favor, and I logged it the way I log everything that matters. Quietly, completely, for later. The thing that finally lit the fuse came 3 months after that dinner, in January, when I was home for a stretch of leave and walked into my mother's kitchen to find a thick cream envelope half buried in the trash under coffee grounds, the Air Force seal embossed across the corner, unmistakable even upside down. I pulled it out. It was addressed to Captain Hannah Reyes, and inside was an engraved invitation to the Air Force Rescue Coordination Gala in San Antonio that spring, a black tie event where they'd be honoring search and rescue crews from the past decade, where 2- and 3-star generals would be in the room, where I'd been asked quietly, and to my genuine shock, to give the keynote. The invitation had gone to my mother's address because that was still the address on file from 20 years earlier, back before I'd ever left her house for good. She came around the corner while I was holding it up to the light, snatched it out of my hand without breaking stride, and tossed it back toward the can. That's a scam, Hannah. People print fake military stuff on envelopes to trick gullible types into clicking a link. You answer phones for a living. Why would anyone send you an invitation like that? It landed face up on the linoleum, my rank staring straight up at the ceiling light. And then, Because the universe apparently runs on irony, my mother announced 2 weeks later that she and Davis would be attending that exact gala. Because Davis had decided it would be the perfect place to network with some real defense people, and she had spent an embarrassing amount of effort getting a friend from her book club to pull a pair of tickets. She told me I could come along, as her plus one, if I wore something plain and dark, carried her bag, stood 3 steps behind her, and did not, under any circumstances, speak unless someone spoke to me first. "I will not have you embarrassing me in a room full of generals," she said, like it was a kindness she was extending. On the night of the gala, I didn't wear my dress blues. I pulled my hair back tight, put on a simple navy dress, and slid my military ID, the one with my rank printed in plain black letters above my photo, the one that would have told anyone who bothered to look exactly who they were dealing with, into the inside pocket of my clutch, where my mother would never think to check. I climbed into the back of Davis's car, perfume thick enough to taste, Davis up front scrolling his phone and laughing at something that wasn't funny to anyone but him, and I thought, almost calmly, tonight I am simply going to let you steer this exactly where it's going. The line at the venue's security checkpoint moved slow, ID badges and credential lanyards getting checked, one by 2 young security forces airmen working the table, no older than 22, sharp-eyed, taking it seriously the way you do when you're new enough to still believe every rule matters. My mother thrust her printed ticket at the nearer one, and started rattling off the names of generals she'd looked up on her phone during the car ride, like dropping names would make the line move faster. The airman barely glanced at her. He looked past her at me, asked politely for ID. My mother let out an exasperated little laugh. "She's just my daughter, she's with me, she does paperwork, you don't need to bother with her. But protocol is protocol," and he held his hand out anyway. I gave him my card. He looked at the photo, looked up at my face to match it, and then his eyes caught the rank line beneath the photo, and something happened to his posture that I have watched happen exactly 4 times in my career and never once gotten tired of. His spine went straight as a flagpole. He said, "Ma'am," in a completely different voice than the one he'd used 30 seconds earlier, turned his head toward the second airman, and said, low and fast, "We've got a captain in line, get the coordinator." The second airman picked up his radio like it had caught fire. My mother actually laughed out loud, that same dismissive laugh, and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, there's some mix-up, she's nobody, she's my assistant for the night." And that's when the venue coordinator, a retired master sergeant named Otis Calloway who I hadn't seen in 11 years, came around the rope line at something close to a jog. I'd pulled Otis out of a burning vehicle outside Bagram in 2014, dragged him 40 yards on a dislocated shoulder while rounds were still cracking past us, and he'd told me on a stretcher with half his face wrapped in gauze that he would spend the rest of his life making sure people knew exactly who I was. He stopped in front of me, came to attention so crisp it looked rehearsed, and said, "Captain Reyes, it is an honor, ma'am. We've been waiting on our keynote all evening, the room is full of people who flew with your cruise." My mother's hand froze on the strap of her clutch. Davis, behind her, made a sound I had genuinely never heard a grown man make before, something between a cough and a whimper. I looked at both of them, just once, and said, quiet and even, the voice I use when a crew is rattled and needs someone to sound like nothing is wrong even when everything is. "I'm fine, Otis. Good to see you standing." Then I walked past the rope line, into the ballroom, and did not look back to see what their faces were doing, though I will admit I would have paid real money for a photograph. Inside, 300 people in mess dress and evening wear stood up out of their chairs as I crossed the floor, the kind of sound a room makes when everyone moves at once, chairs scraping marble like a wave breaking. A lieutenant general I'd flown for twice shook my hand with both of his and said they'd been looking forward to this all year. My official photo went up on the screen behind the podium 20 feet tall, my name under it in gold lettering, keynote speaker, Captain Hannah Reyes, 305th Rescue Squadron. My mother and Davis were seated at a folding table near the back exit, the only 2 name cards handwritten because they'd been added to the list at the last minute, and even from the podium I could see my mother's mascara starting to track down one cheek. I gave the speech I'd written on legal pads during 3 different deployments, about the crews who go toward the gunfire instead of away from it, about rescue swimmers who jump out of a perfectly good helicopter into open ocean at 2 in the morning for someone they will never meet again, about the particular kind of silence that follows a job done right, no parade, no headline, just a family somewhere who still has their person. And then, because I am only human and because 22 years is a long time to carry something, I looked once toward the back table and said, "Some of us spend our whole lives being told we're the unremarkable one in the family." I'd like to say, for the record, that the unremarkable ones are usually the ones holding everything else up. I didn't name her. I didn't have to. Every relative who'd laughed at that Thanksgiving table would have understood exactly who I meant if any of them had been in the room, which, mercifully and not, they weren't. Colonel Priya Okafor found me in the hallway after the closing toast, the woman who'd pulled me out of a collapsed building in Kandahar 9 years earlier, and screamed at me the entire time that I was too stubborn to die. She'd heard the whole story from Otis in about 90 seconds, and she was furious in the specific way only someone who genuinely respects you can be. You let your own mother call you a paperwork girl in front of an Air Force checkpoint, she said, arms crossed, jaw tight. You've flown into places that would make grown men weep, and you let one woman's opinion of you sit there unchallenged for 20 years. How much more are you going to hand that family before you stop? I didn't have an answer for her in that hallway. I had one by the time I got into the car. I rode home alone in a rideshare instead of with Davis, and somewhere around the second highway exit, sitting in the dark with the city lights sliding past the window, I opened my banking app and really looked, for the first time in years, at the standing transfers I'd set up so I'd never have to be asked twice. Monthly deposit to my mother's checking account, quarterly transfer to cover Davis's office lease, an annual lump sum that had, somewhere along the way, become the unspoken payment on a boat I had never once been invited to ride on. I canceled every one of them that night, one at a time, the same unhurried, deliberate way I run a checklist before a flight. 11 transfers, 11 small, specific endings. Then I wrote one email addressed to both of them, no greeting, no softening. I am done financing a version of my life you've never bothered to ask about. Effective tonight, all transfers stop. I attached a single page, my official service summary, redacted where it needed to be, but enough. Captain, United States Air Force, Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 combat tours, 14 confirmed personnel recoveries under hostile fire. I hit send before I could talk myself into softening a single word of it. The fallout arrived in under a week, the way it always does once you stop being the thing quietly holding the roof up. My mother's card declined at the country club in front of 3 women from her bridge group, and somehow that detail traveled back to me within 48 hours through a cousin who clearly enjoyed telling it. Davis's investors, the ones he'd been dazzling with stories about defense contracts, finally ran a basic background check and discovered there was no security clearance, no contract, no consulting history of any kind. Just a sister whose money had been paying his office rent for 2 years. Marissa called me sobbing, asking me to just smooth it over, and I told her, as gently as I could manage, that there was nothing to smooth over because nobody had lied to her except her own husband. My mother showed up at my apartment 10 days later without calling first, mascara already a day old under her eyes, and launched straight into the speech she'd clearly rehearsed in the car. Your father would be ashamed of you, after everything this family has done for you. Davis is going to lose everything because of one bad night. I sat at my kitchen table, hands folded, and let her run all the way out of material, the way you let a storm blow itself out instead of standing in it shouting back. When she finally ran dry and asked me, voice cracking, to say something, anything, I went to the hallway closet and brought back a single framed document I'd had made years ago and never once hung anywhere she could see it. My Distinguished Flying Cross citation, the language spelled out in plain government print. Recovered 2 critically wounded personnel under sustained hostile fire at extreme risk to her own life. I set it on the table in front of her and said, you wanted something you could hold in your hand. There it is. I've been holding it for 14 years. You just never asked to see it. A month later, she called and asked me to come by the old house, just once, just to see something. In the front hall closet behind a stack of winter coats nobody wore anymore, she'd found a shoebox that had belonged to my father, sealed since the year he died. Inside it, wrapped in a folded shop rag that still smelled faintly of motor oil, were 2 things. A newspaper clipping, brittle and yellow, with a small photo of me in my academy dress uniform the day I commissioned, the headline reading, Local Teen Earns Air Force Appointment. He'd kept it. Underneath that was my science fair ribbon, the one I'd thought was lost for 27 years, pressed flat between 2 pieces of cardboard he'd clearly cut and taped together himself. He had laminated it. My father, who never once said the word proud out loud to me in his life, had built me a private archive in a shoebox he never showed a single person, because tenderness, apparently, was a language he only knew how to speak in secret. My mother sat across from me at that same kitchen table, the ribbon between us, and asked the question that finally cracked both of us open at once. Why did you let me treat you like you didn't matter, Hannah? Why didn't you ever just tell me? I didn't have a clean answer, but I gave her the true one. I told her I'd spent my whole life thinking that if I just gave enough, did enough, carried enough, eventually someone would notice without my having to ask. I told her that sacrifice without a single boundary doesn't teach people gratitude. It just teaches them that you're available, and eventually they stop seeing you at all because you've made yourself too easy to overlook. Neither of us was entirely right. Neither of us was entirely wrong. We had both spent 22 years believing love meant disappearing quietly so somebody else could take up the room. At the family reunion that following summer, The wall in my mother's living room that had been covered for 2 decades in Davis's participation trophies and junior league certificates was bare. Every nail pulled, every patch of faded paint exposed where something used to hang. Davis stood on a kitchen chair with a level in one hand, hung my Distinguished Flying Cross citation and my commissioning photo side by side, perfectly straight, and beneath them, on a small brass hook, my father's old shop rag folded into a neat square with the laminated ribbon resting on top of it. He didn't say a word the entire time he was doing it. Before dinner, my mother stood up at the head of the table, gripping the back of her chair to keep her hands from shaking, and said, in front of every relative who had laughed at me at that Thanksgiving table 2 years earlier, "This is my daughter, a captain in the United States Air Force, who has pulled people out of places most of us will never have to imagine, and for 22 years I told her she was less than her brother. I was wrong, and I am asking her, in front of all of you, to finally take up the space she has always deserved." I stood in front of my bathroom mirror a few nights after that, running my thumb over the captain's bars on my uniform jacket, and understood something it had taken me 2 decades and one ruined Thanksgiving to learn. People will salute your rank because regulations require it. They will follow your orders because the chain of command says they have to. But being truly seen by the people who are supposed to love you, that only happens when they make the deliberate, uncomfortable choice to put down what they want to believe about you and look at who you actually are. Pride was never going to come from how much I could silently carry. It came the moment I finally set the weight down and let someone else feel exactly how heavy it had been all along.